Welcome to Journey to Esquire, the podcast. I'm Jocelyn Hardrick, founder and president of Diversity Access Pipeline, Inc., the company behind this podcast and other great programs, like Journey to Esquire Scholarship and Leadership Program, which provides $2,000 cash scholarships to third-year law students and internships to second-year law students, along with leadership training and mentors. And Journey to Esquire, the blog, which provides insightful articles to help navigate you through law school and beyond. Find out more on our website, www.journeytoesquire.com. Hey, have you heard about Anchor? It's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that let you record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer, just like I'm doing now. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so you can hear it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and it's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Welcome to another bonus episode featuring Journey to Esquire and oral history. In this episode, we pass the mic to Donald R. Odom. He's a Saint Petersburg, Florida native, and he graduated from Gibbs High School, University of South Florida, and the University of Florida Law School. He ultimately went on to practice law and became the first of many African Americans who would serve in government entities, including the Hillsborough County Attorney's Office. From 2005 until his retirement, he served as the Deputy County Attorney. His practice has primarily been utilities and local government law. He has some great stories about his time at Gibbs High School, at the University of South Florida, and his graduation from University of Florida Law School in 2.5 years. I had a great time interviewing Mr. Odom, who is thoroughly enjoying his retirement. Thank you for listening to another great episode. Enjoy.
My name is Donald Odom, and I am a retired government attorney. I was Deputy County Attorney for Hillsborough County. I was born in Saint Petersburg, Florida. And when I was about 6 years old, my parents moved to Jacksonville Beach, Florida, where I lived until I was about 14, ready for high school. There's a little bit of an interesting story why I was sent to St. Petersburg to live with my grandparents. The Duval County schools had been disaccredited at that time. The school system was so bad, they disaccredited the whole school system, and there were doubts about if you could get into colleges or where you could go to college. And so my parents thought it would be better to send me to St. Petersburg, where I lived with my grandparents, and I graduated from Gibbs High School in 1968. Of course, during those days, segregation was still in existence, and had I remained in Jacksonville, I would have gone to a segregated school, Douglas Anderson, which was a very long bus ride from where I lived on Jacksonville Beach. And of course, Gibbs High School was segregated also in St. Petersburg. But I decided to be a lawyer when I was about 12 years old. And my basically sole motivation for wanting to do that was Thurgood Marshall. I was always very interested, even as a child, in current events, civil rights. As a child, I remember reading the newspapers every day, and it was something that I really looked forward to. And my parents didn't have to encourage me to do it. It was just something that I enjoyed. And I look back on it, and I look at their socioeconomic status. Neither of them graduated high school. To this day, I don't know why we even had a newspaper subscription, but I'm glad that we did. And so I was a great admirer of Thurgood Marshall, and even at that age, I understood the things that he was doing in using the law to further the prospects for black people in this country. So he was my total inspiration for wanting to go to law school. As a student at Gibbs High School, I was very impressed with first of all the students, and really impressed with the caliber of the teachers we had. And I understand that there are a lot of advantages that come with desegregation and the integration of schools, but in my opinion, I'm not sure that the quality of the teachers that we have now is equal to that I had when I was in high school. And I think there's a simple explanation for that, is that educated black people in those days had very few options. So many of them gravitated towards education. So as a result, we had very high caliber of educators. Many of them classroom teachers had master's degrees, and I would like to think that had it been a different time, some of my high school teachers would have been corporate executives or attorneys or major entrepreneurs, who knows, but they just didn't have the opportunity. So many of them gravitated towards education, which I think benefited us at the time. Gibbs High School, interestingly enough, was named after Jonathan Gibbs, and he was a black man who rose to prominence in Florida during Reconstruction. He was actually, I believe, he held a cabinet position, and I believe it was Secretary of Education, but I'm not sure. My memory fails me, but he was a very distinguished and accomplished man, particularly during his era. And from what I can understand, he became so successful. He was one of those people that engendered a lot of resentment from the white community, and so he was forced to leave Florida at some point, because of threats and things like that. But for those of you who didn't know, that's how Gibbs High School got its name. So I graduated from Gibbs in 1968. I had applied to only one college, and that was Vanderbilt. And I only applied to Vanderbilt because I was invited to. I am the first college graduate from my family, so I really had no guidance in terms of how to prepare for college and how to get scholarships and where to apply. So I only did what people tell me, and someone told me to apply for Vanderbilt, which I applied for, and I didn't get in. It would have taken a tremendous amount of financial aid had I been accepted. So my plan after high school was to attend Saint Petersburg Junior College, as it was called at the time. It's now called Saint Petersburg College. So that summer, I was working, saving money to buy a car and to go to college, and I was going to continue to live with my grandparents. And I just got a telephone call out of the blue from one of the teachers at Gibbs, and I believe it was Mr. Ponder, and he told me that he had gotten wind of a scholarship at the University of South Florida, and asked me if I was interested. So I said sure. And I was awarded a scholarship at the University of South Florida, which covered 2 years, all expenses paid, and then of course the third and fourth years I had to find funding, which actually wasn't a problem. I got loans, but that's how I ended up at the University of South Florida, and I graduated in 1972. When I enrolled at South Florida, I lived in a dorm. I was one of, I believe, 40 students that lived on campus at the time. So that was an interesting experience. I had never gone to class with a white person before. I went to USF, and so of course I was a little apprehensive, but of course when I attended a few classes, I kind of quickly realized that I had nothing to fear. So teachers there were very good at building up your self-confidence, and they used to consistently remind us that times were changing and that we were going to have to compete with white people in the future, and so they were very conscientious about having us to to learn things, even in terms of etiquette and posture and how you carry yourself, things that would make us successful in the world once we graduated. My experience at USF was probably typical for a black student at a predominantly white college during that time. Obviously, I didn't know what to expect. There were, I think, about 100 black students enrolled at USF at the time, and I believe the student population was, I think, around 8,000. I believe about 40 of us actually lived on campus, lived in the dorms. I thought that actually that the white students would be a lot more advanced than I was because of some of the deficiencies, the old cliche, that people my age say, well, we got the old textbooks, after the white students got done with them, then they would send them to us and they'd all be written over and the backs would be torn off. Well, that was true. Our labs were, not up to standards. So, we had reason to believe that maybe we had gotten an inferior education, but once I got to the University of South Florida and started competing with the white students, I found that not to be the case. After graduating from, I talked about the dearth of black students on campus, but there were no black professors when I was at the university. When I arrived at the University of South Florida, I believe we subsequently got what we adjunct professors. I'm trying to remember who. There was a Reverend Dr. Smith, who was a minister from Saint Petersburg. He was an adjunct professor, and there was one other whose name I can't remember now. I believe the first real professor we got was Dr. Wayne Dudley, who taught African American studies. So as a result of that problem, very few black students, few black professors. We were somewhat active politically as students, and it's probably one reason why I never joined a fraternity. I was always, we sort of felt like you had to be politically active, or you had, be in a fraternity, and I chose to be politically active. Even though some of the fraternities got chartered while I was at South Florida, I never joined one. So as a result of my role on campus, I did serve as the president of the Black Student Union for a term. We did have a couple of marches on campus and a couple of demonstrations. Actually, my cousin, who was a few years older than me, he had been in the Air Force and he came back. Actually, led a couple of the protests that we had at the University of South Florida. They have a pageant now that's called the Miss Uhuru pageant. They still have it. My late wife was the first Miss Black Uhuru. Yeah, Barbara was the first Miss Black Uhuru. So it was a very interesting experience. We as black students, of course, we all knew one another. We all supported one another, and the upperclassmen went out of their way to assist us. So it was a real kind of a character building experience, and I think I got a lot out of it. I worked at USF. I was a tutor for elementary school kids. We had a program there they call intensive tutorial, and I worked on that for about 3 years, I think. So I really enjoyed that also. I started law school, I think it was in 74. Again, I didn't know what to expect. I applied to Howard, and actually they told me that my application didn't reach them before the deadline, which I don't understand because I mailed it a couple of days before. But that's what they told me. So I don't know if I would have gotten accepted or not. but I'd also applied to UF, and they did accept me with a fairly good financial package. But my wife, still had to work, to kind of support us through law school. So obviously I didn't know what to expect. So I arrived on campus, or we arrived on campus for classes, and I think at the time there was, gosh, I should have asked somebody before I came. There were very few black students, probably no more than 30 in the law school, and I think there were maybe 8 in my class, maybe. As I said, I graduated in 72. I got married in my senior year. I married my high school sweetheart. Her name was Barbara Hill, and we quickly had our first child, a girl. I worked after graduation. As I said, I graduated in 72. Of course, always with the idea in the back of my head that I would eventually go to law school. So I worked a couple of years. I think I worked as a debt collector for a while, and I worked as a youth counselor for a while. It was about 2.5, 3 years before I was able to get into law school. So Barbara and I, with our daughter, went to Gainesville and University of Florida. And at the time we were on the quarter system, so I was in a real hurry. So I went year-round. I never took a break, and I was able to graduate in 6 quarters, which was like 2.5 years. I don't know if you can still do that or not. So when I graduated law school, of course, I was on the job search. And there were very few, of course, black lawyers in the community, and white firms were not hiring. But the first lawyer that I ever met, whose name was Ike Williams, had a firm in Saint Petersburg. And he had a partner, Morris Milton, Williams and Milton. And they hired me as a law clerk before I passed the bar at the stunning salary of $8,500 a year. And when I passed the bar, I got a big raise. I got up to $9,000 a year. So, but it was a community-based law firm. We did everything. We did, personal injury was always the bread and butter, but we did criminal and I did a lot of Social Security work, believe it or not. I don't know how, but they kept coming in. So I think I stayed there about four years, and then someone came to me with my first public sector job, which was at the Health and Human Services, the state of Florida Health and Human Services, and I only worked there for about I think it was less than 2 years, and my second public sector job came along, which was the assistant city attorney for the city of Saint Petersburg, and I was the first African American assistant city attorney that he had. Judge Wilson had clerked there before, but he never became an assistant city attorney. So I was the first assistant city attorney in the city of St. Petersburg. So the big shock about law school was that it was unlike regular academic study, and they used the Socratic method, and of course you had to get used to that. I was talking to someone about. Someone asked me, well, why aren't there more computer classes for law schools? And I said, well, because they do the Socratic method, and it's hard to do that on a computer. And I was trying to explain to them that that's part of the training, to sit there and not know if the professor is going to call on you, but be ready to respond if the professor calls on you, and respond in front of your peers. So that's, I think, an important part of the legal education. We were all, of course, we were all sort of, as black students, we all kind of thought maybe that there was something not straight about the grading, but of course you can never prove anything like that, and so what do? You just go and you do your best, Certain professors had, reputation, for being better to black students, and of course everybody wanted to take their classes, and others, not so much. So, it's something that was maybe unique to me is I never belonged to a study group when I was in law school, and when I look back on it now, and I talk to people, almost everybody belonged to a study group. I guess I just never really realized how important it was or how it could have helped me. But I just always did it on my own. Took the bar in '77. I graduated in December of '76. Took the bar in '77 and passed it, and went to work for Mr. Williams. He was a very good lawyer. He was a real resource to the community there in Saint Petersburg. He did a lot of civil rights work, and his partner Morris Milton also did a lot of civil rights work. So with them as mentors, I actually got involved in some political things and some civic things when I lived in St. Petersburg. I was chairman of the Legal Redress Committee for the St. Petersburg NAACP. I belonged to the St. Petersburg Community Alliance, which was a race relations group. I was a member of the Charter Review Board back in the 70s, in the early 80s, and they meant to review and make changes to the St. Petersburg City Charter. And it's interesting, one of my biggest accomplishments occurred very early in my career, because as a member of that board, I was able to assist in getting a new district map drawn for elections that made it more favorable that someone from the black community could be elected to the city council. So that still stands, and hopefully that would be kind of my legacy. Going back to work with Mr. Williams, and one of my friends called me when they got the vacancy at the county attorney's office, and I actually went and interviewed for it, and I was hired. George Butler preceded me there. He was there when I got there. So George was the first African American at the Hillsborough County Attorney's Office as an assistant county attorney. For the first, from 85 when I started until my wife passed in 2003, I commuted from St. Petersburg to Tampa to work. My wife was working there, and my kids were in school there, so I just opted to just commute. Barbara decided to go into the ministry later in life, in her 40s, and she did become a United Methodist minister when she was in her early 40s. She pastored a relatively large integrated church in St. Petersburg, but she was only able to do that for, I think she was a minister for less than 10 years before she passed away. She was the pastor of Lakewood United Methodist Church in St. Petersburg. So when she passed, I decided to move to Hillsborough County. So I got involved with the University of South Florida, the African American Advisory Committee. I've been a member of that over at USF. I'm a life member of the NAACP. I worked on a couple of voter registration drives here in St. Petersburg. But my tenure at the county attorney's office, which lasted from about 85 until 2012 was mostly positive. I came into the office at a time of rapid expansion, and I believe I was the 12th lawyer that they hired, and at our height we were up to I think 50 lawyers. So I was able to kind of mature as the need for leadership developed. I was there, and I tried to be prepared to step into those leadership roles. So eventually I became a section head, the municipal services section, and I ended up being a utilities lawyer, which is sort of the complete opposite and has nothing to do with what I wanted to do. Being a fan of Thurgood Marshall, I always thought that I would be, a civil rights lawyer. But of course, that whole, practice had changed so much over the years, and it just was not something that I had an opportunity to do. So it was interesting. Was a good learning experience, and actually it was the first time that I'd ever, I practiced at the state, which was a large agency, but the office where I worked only had 2 lawyers. So the city attorney's office was the first agency where I worked where we had multiple lawyers, and of course I was the only black lawyer there. It was a positive experience. I did not experience any overt racism there. There were a couple of things that happened that were a little bit subtle, and I can describe a couple of them. I remember one day I had to go speak to one of the, actually I think he was the office manager about something, and I went to his door, and his door was closed, and I heard him, we had a full-time investigator, and I heard him sort of in a muffled tone through the door before I knocked on the door, something to the effect, "Have you seen buckwheat today?" Well, being the only African American on staff, I mean, who were they talking about? And so, I mean, I went back to my office and I sort of thought about it, and I said, well, what is the appropriate response to this? I mean, do I go to the boss or do I confront them, myself? And I just kind of thought about it. I said, well, they didn't say it to me. They didn't know that I heard it, so I just opted to just let it go. There was another kind of an interesting situation that came up. There was a policeman, a white policeman on the police force at the time, who had a real history of being abusive to black people in the community. He had several complaints, and one that really made the news, made the media, was where he had beat up a black woman, and clearly, most people thought it was unjustified. So of course, he was sued by the woman, and they wanted me to defend him. And so again, here's a decision that I have to make. I mean, I have to support my family, but it's just something that I think is going to be very distasteful to me. So I thought about it, and I just told my boss that I couldn't do it. And as far as to his credit, as far as I know, there was never any repercussions or negative feedback from it. I think the thing that sort of made me push me to the decision that I made was that they had never asked me to be lead counsel in a case before. So why this one? And I think the question is kind of obvious. So the answer to the question was obvious. So I just decided, if I have to get another job, I'll just have to get another job. And my mother was very. She just wanted the best for her kids, and she was very protective. I can remember And she's very kind of nervous, and she didn't want us to play football and all kinds of things like that. Of course, we did it anyway, but it just seems to me like she was just really overprotective. And sometimes I think back, and I'm going like, well, it's kind of amazing that we were able to do the stuff that we did, because if we listened to her, we would have never done anything. And my father was quiet, and I kind of take after him. He didn't really talk to us a lot, but you could kind of tell the way that he felt about us. Number one, from the way he worked and the way that he took care of us. But whenever we had an accomplishment, like in school or whatever, he was just like, he would just beam with pride, and he bragged to all of his friends. He was a bartender at the Ponte Vedra Club in Ponte Vedra, right outside of Jacksonville. He did that for like 40 years. And of course, at that time, blacks weren't allowed, to go there. We couldn't afford it even if we wanted to. So I can remember about 6 years ago, I went to visit my mom, and I said, you know what, I think I'm going to stay at the Ponte Vedra Club. So I stayed at the Ponte Vedra Club. And so that was kind of like a milestone. And then, I started playing golf, about 4 years ago. And so I actually played golf there last year. So that was kind of a milestone also, which, if my dad was alive and he could see that, no telling what his reaction would be. Growing up in Florida, you would think that, I did a lot of swimming growing up. And I did swim, but during those days, black people were limited in where they could swim. There was one public swimming pool in Saint Petersburg that I could use, and it was called Jenny Hall Pool. And there's the history with that is there were no places for black people to swim in Saint Petersburg back then. So this white woman, whose name was Jenny Hall, actually donated the money to build a swimming pool on the south side of St. Petersburg for black people to swim. And the swimming pool still bears her name. There was one place that I can recall that we could swim down on the bay, and it was called the South Mole, I think. And I have subsequently learned that was the swimming outlet that was closest to where the city dumped the sewage in those days, which of course growing up I knew nothing about that. As a child growing up in Jacksonville, I lived 10 blocks from the Atlantic Ocean, but we were not allowed to swim in the Atlantic Ocean. So in order to swim, we had to drive over to Fernandina in American Beach. I can barely remember American Beach, but it was, from what I understand, it was quite a place. They had black-owned hotels and nightclubs and restaurants, a whole strip, and people would come, well-to-do black people would come from all over the country and vacation there. I understand that a sizable number of properties there are still owned by black families that have been in the families for generations. So I can recall driving back from after a day at the beach. As I recall, it was because you had to take a ferry, and it was probably like an hour and a half drive, And I can recall driving back late at night, with my family. And if somebody had to go to the bathroom, of course, you had to pull to the side of the road because you couldn't use like the public facilities. So it was just kind of one of those indignities that you had to get through, in those days when you were black.
Mr. Odom shared with us some very important stories, particularly about his life growing up in Florida and the Tampa Bay area, and his experience with segregation and the impact that had on his life and his worldview. My impression of Mr. Odom is that he is very humble. But don't underestimate the important work that he did, not only as a pioneering attorney in the government offices in Tampa Bay, but also the work to dismantle segregation and exclusion and to create access for everyone in Tampa Bay. For more information on Journey to Esquire and oral history, visit our website, www.journeytoesquire.com. I'd like to give a special thanks to all of our supporters, especially our JD level sponsors, U.S. District Courts, Middle District of Florida's Bench Bar Fund, and Agape Christian Bar Preparation Services, Inc., for their generous support. I'd also like to thank WMU, Cooley Law School, Tampa Bay campus for providing a space for the recording of several of the episodes of this podcast. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to another great episode of Journey to Esquire, the podcast. Support, share, subscribe. And for more, visit www.journeytoesquire.com.